Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Paolo Radaelli from the Physics Department, University of Oxford. I'd like to welcome you to the department and to this special public lecture entitled Minerva Laboratory, Laura Bassi in the Pursuit of Science in 18th Century Italy. Let me share the screen for a moment. This lecture was organized in collaboration with the Italian Embassy in London and the Association of Italian Scientists in the UK. Today's subject may seem unusual for our physics department, and not much is generally known about it even in Italy, and alone elsewhere, which with more than a touch of snobism, Italians consider themselves as being rather backwards in terms of social progress. And most would be rather surprised to learn that the first woman was admitted to University of Bologna in 1088, 20 years after the Battle of Hastings, at least according to the University of Bologna website. Laura Bassi herself, perhaps the most famous of them all, is not exactly a household name, nor very much is known about the extraordinary cultural and period and environment in which she lived. She has some notoriety, though. There is an icebreaker named after her, which in a previous incarnation used to be known as the Royal Research Ship Ernest Shackleton, a testimony of the strong links in science between the two countries. There's also a crater on Mars, actually on Venus, and an asteroid named after her. And Google recently dedicated a doodle to her, but more on this later. Yet, with the subject of gender being more than ever in the foreground of discussions in the physical science in general and in physics in particular, there's no better time to learn what people were thinking about this at the dawn of the scientific age. Tonight, I have the great pleasure to welcome an exceptional speaker to tell us about this, which is indeed her favorite subject. Professor Paula Findlen obtained her PhD at University of California, Berkeley in 1989, having previously studied and done research at University of Chicago and Wesley College. She was first assistant professor and then associate professor at UC Davis and later Stanford. And since 2002, she is the Ubaldo Pierotti Professor in Italian History at Stanford, where she also chaired the history department for a period. She gave many prestigious invited lectures and held visiting positions in Princeton, Yale, Groningen, Uppsala, Paris, and many other places around the world. She has written extensively, mainly on the history of science and museum collections in Italy in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and early modern period, and her numerous books have won many prizes and awards. I know you cannot clap, but please join me in welcoming Professor Paula Findlen.
Thank you so much. This is a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that we don't have the chance to be here in person, but on the other hand, I'm delighted to have a chance to do this lecture, and the timing could not be better. So a warm thank you to Professor Paolo Radaelli, to Maud Schmidt and Helen Smith for making all the arrangements for this today. So what I am going to do now is to share my screen and we can get started. Let me get that up. Let's see, actually this, one second, I'm gonna stop share because this is the non-dynamic one that's there. Here we go. And now. So I have spent, for my sins, many years of my life being fascinated by Laura Bassi and her world, not only by her, but by other scientific women in 18th century Italy. And I have researched and written on them along with a series of other colleagues, mostly in Italy, but also in Germany and Canada, who have been fascinated. And I think we're at a kind of interesting moment in the story on Laura Bassi. So, and part of that is, of course, occasioned by the fact that on April 17th this year, just a month ago, Laura Bassi became a Google Doodle. And I don't know the full backstory about why she did, but it led me to write the version of the talk I'm going to give today, and that I'll also share with you because I've just published it yesterday online. So anyone who wants a written version as well, we'll make sure that we share a link at some point. But let me, of course, get started to give you a chance today to learn more about Laura Bassi and her world, and why 18th century Bologna was a very interesting place to become a woman of science. Laura Bassi was born in Bologna in 1711 and died there in 1778. As I've long argued, she was probably the first woman to have a paid scientific career and to be institutionally recognized for what she did. This is hardly the whole of her story, but it's certainly a reason to remember her. 1732 was Bassi's Annus Mirabilis, when a chain of unexpected events catapulted a studious lawyer's daughter from utter obscurity into the public eye. Latin grammar lessons with a priestly cousin gave Bassi access to an entire library of learning. She slaked her curiosity and wanted more. No one objected. Bassi parlayed knowledge of an ancient language into a comprehensive education in philosophy and science with a medical professor who was the family physician tending her mother's ailments. This was the age of Sir Isaac Newton, whose physics, optics, and mathematics redefined the very nature of science, or rather, we should say philosophy. Mostly we forget that the full title of Newton's Principia was Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, right? The word science is nowhere there. Bassi and her generation understood that science was a part of philosophy. And so on March 20th, 1732, following private examinations at her home by leading men of science, Laura Bassi became the first woman admitted to the Bologna Academy of Sciences, also known in Italian as the Istituto delle Scienze, and this still exists today. I have the pleasure of being an honorary member, I think because of my work on Laura Bassi, and so it's both a beautiful building and a wonderful active research institute in Bologna still today. Her membership in this academy was the first step on the road to a full-fledged career as a Newtonian physicist. On April 17th, the date of Google's doodle, Bassi publicly defended 49 philosophical theses. They were not dissertations in any modern sense, but short Latin statements worthy of debate between professors and students, derived from reading the entire corpus of natural and philosophical knowledge since antiquity. Think of it as a kind of super comprehensive oral exam in an ancient language, a rite of passage for university students in times past to present themselves as degree candidates. Half the audience, I'm quite sure, understood little or nothing of what she said, but experts ponderously certified the quality and content of this virtuoso performance. She already had the full support, after all, of the Academy members because she was already an academician at this point. And so following this, on May 12th, Laura Bassi received her degree in philosophy, as it was then called, though this, as I've already told you, included much of science, especially physics. Her focus especially was indeed natural philosophy. And to commemorate this moment, a silver medal exists. You can see this in Bologna. This is the one at the Archiginnasio in Bologna, but we also actually acquired, in the serendipity of these things, a version of it came up for sale some years ago around the time of her anniversary in 2011, and my own university, Stanford, also has one in special collection. So there are a few of them out there that still exist. Bassi is the second woman graduate we can document anywhere in the world. Her predecessor's experience helped to define her possibilities. In 1678, the Venetian Elena Lucrezia Cornaro Piscopia received also a philosophy degree from the University of Padua, not Bologna. Piscopia's original request was to be examined in theology. And as you can imagine, when the Archbishop of Padua found out about this, he was in Rome at the time, he was utterly outraged. And so a negotiation went on, and they ultimately decided that she could instead get a degree in philosophy. And so this became the alternative in 1678. Philosophy, after all, was a subject without a clear professional outcome, unlike law or medicine. And it was also not theology, where Christian values and traditions further complicated the matter, right? So think of philosophy as a very open-ended area within this university map of knowledge. Now, the University of Padua did not want to open the floodgates. And so in February of 1679, months after joyously celebrating their first woman graduate, they met and resolved not to admit any more women to degree candidates. And this was a promise that Padua kept until the 20th century. Piscopia remained the exception, and yet she inadvertently created the template for Bassi's degree in a different city more than 50 years later. Bologna was an even older university than Padua, and it had long debated the existence of its women graduates and professors in law and possibly medicine, going as far back as the Middle Ages. Stories about these women were told and retold throughout the centuries. One even made its way into Christine de Pisan's Book of the City of Ladies around 1405, but no one thought to interrogate this tradition until the 18th century. The year 1722, when Laura Bassi was 11 years old, inspired a failed effort to revive this medieval tradition. Maria Vittoria Delfini Dossi, the 16-year-old daughter of a Bolognese aristocrat, became a candidate for a degree in law. Her father and tutors assured everyone she was well prepared. Plans were set in motion to have her publicly defend her legal conclusions at the Spanish college. An emissary was sent all the way to Padua to research how to give a woman a degree. Once again, naysayers worried about setting a bad precedent. They decided to go into the Bolognese archives and do their own research on the story of the medieval women graduates. And they found absolutely nothing in the institutional records that confirmed the tradition that had long been discussed. And at this point, of course, I had to add that it must be fairly said that since administrative records did not exist that far back, when the university was basically a startup, this was a foregone conclusion that that was not the place you could find any evidence. So the result of this was that Delfini Dossi presented her legal conclusions, but did not receive a law degree in 1722. And this was, of course, the talk and the scandal of Bologna at that time. A young law student who witnessed these debates, named Alessandro Machiavelli, not Machiavelli of the famous prince, right, of 2.5 centuries earlier, but actually a Bolognese descendant of the same family that had migrated from Florence in the Middle Ages. Very funny story about him. So what does he do? You see this, I have it up here. Machiavelli publishes under his older brother's name a lengthy defense of the female doctorate. And he argued that memory and tradition were equally powerful in establishing precedents, and supplied all sorts of counter evidence to support the existence of the learned medieval women of Bologna. So he does all sorts of things, including forging evidence that did not exist. I've loved calling Alessandro Machiavelli my feminist forger of Bologna, because that in fact is what he manages to do. But he does ultimately provide part of this public conversation that's the background to Laura Bassi ultimately getting a degree in 1732. So this brings us, of course, now to where we are at the moment. 10 years later, Bassi becomes the first woman to enter the University of Bologna's institutional record. Curious onlookers witnessed Bassi's degree in a public event that seemed more like the Oscars than a scholastic rite of graduation. People dressed up, they went to lavish after parties to celebrate their woman graduate in 1732. It was this terrific spectacle. But what exactly did it mean for Laura Bassi? Bassi now had a degree and a professorship, plus an ermine graduate's cape and a silver crown of laurels. At the time of her graduation, poets praised her as Bologna's Minerva. They compared her to Petrarch's Laura, right, a play on her name, suggesting that she combined the mind of this 14th century poet-philosopher, who himself had been awarded a crown of laurels for his eloquence and learning on the steps of the Capitoline in 1341, all those centuries ago, with the beauty of his famous unrequited love, Laura, right? She was both Laura and Petrarch, right, in the poetry written about her in 1732. This kind of allegorical praise put Bassi on a pedestal. She was far more symbol than reality. So Bassi had equaled Piscopia's historic achievement, but what would come next? Soon, a growing chorus of admirers was arguing that Bassi was well qualified to teach, not just to have a degree. With the support of the Archbishop of Bologna, Prospero Lambertini, who was a very important figure in Bassi's life, the university awarded her a paid professorship in what they called universal philosophy on October 1732. This subject encompassed most sciences as well as the modern discipline of philosophy. The salary, 500 lira, was significant. Many male graduates taught gratis for years, hoping eventually to receive a paid position. In fact, the one other woman in Bologna who was then famous for her scientific learning, at least locally famous, she was a Cartesian, not a Newtonian, suggested that it was utterly undignified for Laura Bassi to accept this salary. But then Laura Bentivoglio da Via was an aristocrat with an independent income. Money mattered if you were cut from far more ordinary cloth. Bassi accepted this professorship, and on December 18th, she gave her first public lecture, in which she talked about the role of modesty and virtue, right, in the pursuit of philosophy. I think partly to quell people from thinking that she was, as many said, making a spectacle of herself, right? So she then talks about the philosophical virtues of also of moderation, right? No excessive arrogance, so she's kind of presenting herself as a spectacle of modesty, which is a paradox, but there we have it. Bassi occupied this university professorship for the rest of her life. In fact, here we see her 2 years later giving a public lecture in Bologna's Anatomy Theater, a site that still exists today in the Archiginnasio in Bologna. And some of you may know it, in fact, you can visit this. But here we see her in one of the most public events of the university that happened during the Winter Carnival every year, where bodies would be dissected not just for medical students, for the public, and the professors, not just of medicine, but of many sciences, would be brought in to talk about scientific knowledge related to the body. So here we see her doing all of these things. Much later in her career, Bassi held 2 other professorships at different institutions, the Collegio Montalto in 1766, and ultimately the Bologna Academy, the Istituto delle Scienze in 1776. Both of these other professorships were awarded not because of what happened in 1732, but in recognition of Laura Bassi's accomplishments in physics. Bassi's desire to turn a largely honorific position into an opportunity and a career began almost immediately after the publicity surrounding her degree and professorship subsided. Her first step, in fact, was very modest, was to recognize the limits of the education that she had had that had brought her to this precipice. And so in 1732, Laura Bassi knew that she already had studied a great deal of natural philosophy, but not much mathematics. Without this knowledge, it would be impossible to participate in expert conversations about Newtonian natural philosophy. Studying differential calculus with the best mathematics professor in the city, Gabriele Manfredi, she delved further into Newton's physics and began to experiment. In fact, some years later, at the end of the 1730s, she would cite her study with Manfredi as one of the many reasons she ought to get a raise. Gossiping tongues questioned Laura Bassi's morals. Here she was, always alone in the company of men, as people said repeatedly in this early phase of her life. A priest was sent all the way from Rome to offer his advice on how to handle her unusual position. Unsavory rumors circulated about her relations with the older men who were her mentors, teachers, and now colleagues. Some of them, in fact, I'm sorry to say, were fueled by the men who fell in love with her and wrote about it. So we can actually see this in their correspondence at the time, what they think of her. In every possible register. While becoming more proficient in science in her early 20s, Bassi squarely confronted the problem of trying to do anything with her degree and her professorship. She was a young single woman in a society that had no defined role for who she had become. How could she fully realize her ambition? The answer was to make the right marriage. Being single was a moral conundrum unless she became a nun, which would effectively curtail her aspirations. The 18th century was filled with unhappy marriages and misalliances. There was no divorce in Catholic lands. Sex, money, property heirs, and conflicting values produced endless litigation and church-sanctioned separations. In 1738, some months before her 27th birthday, Laura Bassi married the young medical professor and fellow academician Giuseppe Veratti in the church of San Petronio. Not everyone applauded her decision. Placards criticized her decision to give up her celibacy. Carnal knowledge produced new gossip. In fact, there was a joke going around written in Bolognese dialect that all their children are going to be made with science and born speaking Latin, right, at the moment of birth. When a friend joked that Bassi probably met her spouse by replicating Newton's prism experiments in the dark, Laura Bassi, who by then was already pregnant with their first child, responded by discussing her choice of marriage partner in a remarkable letter that I want to show you here. I have chosen a person who walks the same path of learning, she wrote in 1738, and who, from long experience, I was certain would not dissuade me from it. She married Veratti in no small part because he actively supported her desire to pursue science and shared her interests. This is a very important fact about Laura Bassi and what she's able to do from this point on in her life. And, you know, essentially how she solves the problem, right, of her 20s about how she's going to go forward. And one of the reasons that Bassi was so upset about these jokes about meeting your spouse doing experiments in the dark is because of a best-selling book that had just appeared the year before by somebody who had also studied in Bologna, a Venetian named Francesco Algarotti, who in 1737 published what became a best-selling book for a period called Newtonianism for Ladies. And time doesn't permit me to talk about this really fascinating book, which is ultimately translated into English by Elizabeth Carter and also into many other languages, goes into many editions in Italian. But this is a book that popularizes and captures that vogue for Newtonian physics through the optics, right? This is physics without math. This is physics that is also a form of seduction, a conversation, as we see in the frontispiece of this, between a young, attractive male philosopher who looks suspiciously like Algarotti and an aristocratic woman who knows nothing about science but has gotten really curious. Why? Why? Because Algarotti sets his dialogue in 1732 in the moments just after Laura Bassi has received her degree and is the talk not just only of Bologna, but of the world. There are newspaper articles about her in German and French. I mean, there's all sorts of publicity going all over the place. People are fascinated. So he captures that moment of celebrity and turns it into a kind of story of, a bestseller, right, about the seduction of science, and why the world should fall in love with Newton. And, this was not the publicity that someone like Laura Bassi wanted. This was the publicity that Algarotti wanted for his own career. Indeed, was very successful from this. But I think it made her especially sensitive to jokes that were obviously inspired by this book about her own life. And so let me return now to her own life, right? And not to, bad jokes about experimenting in the dark. Together, Bassi and Veratti established a home laboratory. 8 children were born amidst the prisms and Leyden jars, 5 of which survived infancy. Bassi's unusual partnership with Veratti made it possible to become an accomplished Newtonian physicist and experimenter. At the height of her fame, she and her husband had one of the finest experimental physics cabinets in Italy, and therefore really anywhere, as a matter of fact. She had found the right partner in life, love, and work, and they had a long and fruitful marriage. Initially, Bassi's teaching was restricted to on-demand public lectures, something that she chafed against, and even at times suggested lectures that then the university would consider and for some reason would never quite get around to doing. No one thought a pregnant woman should teach young male students was fundamentally the problem. Bassi began to offer private lessons at home while pursuing her research. And in 1745, her domestic science became the basis of her request to Lambertini, who by this point was no longer Archbishop. Well, actually, he still was Archbishop of Bologna. He held that job also because he cared so much about the city. But by 1745, he has become Pope Benedict XIV. And so she, in 1745, writes to his secretary, and essentially to him through his secretary, to request that the Pope appoint her to a new elite category of researchers that he had created with his own funds within the Bologna Academy of Sciences, known as the Benedictines. Right, this is her next move after her marriage. Is, she begins to lay the groundwork teaching at home, still not having much of a sort of public, her role in the university is still fairly ceremonial, but also beginning to think about what the other opportunities will be. And this one comes along, right? The Pope is going to create this elite group. She wants to be part of it. She believes she has the right to be part of it based on her work that she's done, not credentials, but her work at this point. And so she makes this request. What she does is to request a special opportunity to avoid being perceived as competing directly with her male colleagues. This was very, I think, strategic of her. And to use that position to increase both her status and her earnings. But Bassi, as she says to the Pope's secretary, makes the argument from utility. By becoming a Benedictine, she argues, she would be able to fulfill what she calls my obligation to the public. I would not want to remain entirely useless, right? She underscores over and over again how much she dislikes the ceremonial aspects of what she had initially been offered. Benedictines were obliged to present their research annually in order to receive their stipend. And as a result, we have an institutional record of the evolution of Bassi's research as a physicist. From 1745 until her death in 1778, Laura Bassi was the 25th Benedictine of the Institute for Sciences, an extra position retired upon her death and only revived once thereafter, in March 1800, when the Bologna Academy of Sciences gave Maria dalle Donne, the first woman to receive a medical degree in Bologna, the position that Bassi had occupied. As they called it, we are reviving the position of the late, great Dottoressa Signora Laura Bassi. And let me just stop here to give you an example of the discussion that went on in 1745 about what exactly her role as a Benedictine would be. No one objected to her, once the position had been created, to her giving public lectures on her research annually, as all the Benedictines were obliged to do. But when Bassi suggested that she also should be attending all the meetings, deliberating on decisions made, including who would be admitted to the academy, even her closest supporters, with the notable exception of her husband, who was also a member, right, of this group, balked at her being fully a participant. And I think this particular quotation by somebody who was actually otherwise very sympathetic to her sums up the discomfort that we see in the middle of the 18th century, not at the fact of Laura Bassi, but the fact of having her all the time in their ordinary, not extraordinary business. As Galeazzi writes, to be always alone in the midst of an assembly of men, to hear all their discourses and quarrels doesn't seem to befit the decency and modesty of her sex. So still, even at this point, right, there are barriers and restrictions that she needs to deal with. So that returns me to the other side. What is Bassi now doing at home now that she's a Benedictine? Bassi's private course of experimental physics was flourishing. By 1749, it was formally established as a school, right? The Scuola di Fisica Sperimentale, when all her children, save for her youngest son, Paolo, had been born. This school became so valuable that it was the basis for numerous requests by Laura Bassi for subsequent raises. She ultimately died as one of the highest paid professors of the university. And by the way, she made these requests not only for herself, but also for her husband. I'm not kidding. Those of us who go to the archives know this. Giuseppe Veratti's requests for his salary increases were written by his wife. You can tell that from the handwriting. It's very distinctive. Bassi's pragmatic attention to both of their careers, indeed the necessity of earning a living to support a growing family, is one of the quietly remarkable facts of her life, in my opinion. Her understanding of what it meant to modernize instruction in an emerging field rightfully earned her the admiration of a growing number of colleagues and students over these years in which the school flourished. Young men came not only from all over Italy, but it was said from Germany, from Spain, from Greece, and perhaps from other places as well that we can no longer document, to study with her in Bologna. And all of them fondly recalled going to Signora Dottoressa Laura Bassi's school. The 31 research papers that Bassi presented at the Bologna Academy reflect a broad range of interests in the evolution of physics during her century. Today, most of them exist only as a list of topics. 10 of her papers dealt with mechanics, several with optics, including ongoing improvements to Newtonian telescopes. 7 discussed electricity, an emerging and popular subject right by the middle of the century that both she and Veratti were very involved in, and others concerned the emerging sciences of physiology and chemistry, especially the nature of air. In broad strokes, Bassi followed the evolution of the Newtonian sciences by attending to the work of experimenters such as Benjamin Franklin, Stephen Hales, and Joseph Priestley, all of them avowed Newtonians. She kept up with her subject, and had more of her research survived, we might appreciate her thoughtful interventions in different problems along the lines of an early paper that she did publish in the Bologna Academy's publication known as the Commentaries. And in this early paper, for instance, she discusses exceptions to Boyle's law of gases. Having worked with her papers for many years, I can tell you that she was a careful, incisive, and well-informed researcher, which surely helps to explain why she was also a fine physics professor. And here we see Bassi talking, right, 10 years into her work as a Benedictine and well into the evolution of her School of Experimental Physics, right? This was an 8-month course that she taught every year from 1749 onwards in her school with daily lessons, right, daily opportunities to work with her equipment, to try things out, to debate them, and to, of course, to learn, right, to hear her lectures, as people talked about repeatedly. And here we see Bassi talking about how experimental physics has become, in our times, such a useful and necessary science. She was very proud, not of being an exception, but of being on the forefront, right, of a new and important subject in her time, engendered as one of the legacies of Isaac Newton. And here, this is one of my favorite archival discoveries of the work I've done over the years on Laura Bassi. It's not in Bologna, it's actually in an archive nearby in a small town. This is a certificate for one of her students that says in Latin, and here you see Laura Bassi's handwriting and her signature, that he had spent a year studying experimental physics with her. So this is the certificate of completion that he takes away to show his credentials, that he is a student of Laura Bassi and has studied the subject with her. It's a wonderful example of this kind of documentation that we have for Bassi. Science for Bassi was very much a family business. In 1778, when Laura Bassi died, Veratti succeeded his wife as professor of experimental physics after being her assistant. Their youngest son, Paolo, followed in his parents' footsteps and eventually held this position too, even though he struggled to earn a living after both of his parents were gone and ultimately had to sell the family's physics cabinet. A century later, the Curies became a family dynasty of scientists. The women, Marie and her daughter Irene, winning attention initially thanks in part to the limelight of the famous Pierre Curie. But in Bassi's case, and I think the contrast is interesting, it was entirely the other way around. She was the one who provided opportunities for her husband and her sons. And here again, I want to stop, and you can imagine her youngest son, Paolo, is part of this scene about the way that her disciples, all of the male, talked about her. Mia venerata maestra, says Lazzaro Spallanzani, who was a cousin, right, a relation, who always said that he had stopped studying law and become a scientist because he had been inspired by his older cousin, Bassi. He dedicated one of his early publications to her and later said that of the physics teachers in Italy, he could think of no one who was better. And here we see the far less famous, but nonetheless interesting Rocco Bovio, who was a Dominican and a professor of trigonometry in Naples, and had also gotten a degree in Bologna. He dedicates a book to Laura Bassi in 1775 and sends it to her with this note. Certainly, I would be a most ungrateful disciple, he writes, if I did not preserve the memory and obligation that I have for you at a distance. Laura Bassi spent the final years of her life asking to be considered for a position in the very field that she had defined for her city, experimental physics. We forget how novel such research was in the 18th century. The university had no professorship in this area. It offered a very traditional curriculum that it was only slowly modernizing. The Institute for Sciences, by contrast, specifically offered instruction in subjects not taught at the university. Its bequest sponsored endowed professorships in modern disciplines, including experimental physics. Bassi's male colleague who held the position was not especially well qualified for the job, and by the mid-1770s, his health was failing. No one was better qualified for the Institute professorship than Laura Bassi. For one thing, her private laboratory was filled with state-of-the-art instruments superior to those at the Institute itself, right? She had a better laboratory than they did. Even her critics could not deny her abilities in her chosen subject. And so Bassi hoped by this point that her time had finally come to get this final recognition for the work she had done. In May of 1776, a difficult conversation occurred behind closed doors. Everyone agreed that Bassi, as they put it, had no right to be admitted among the Institute professors. Some still considered her demands to be excessive and immodest. In the end, however, her colleagues offered her this professorship in 1776, right, the year that Bovie writes and dedicates this book to her, realizing that they could take advantage of her talent, knowledge, resources, and yes, her fame to revive the Institute's reputation in physics, which was flagging by this point. That summer found Bassi hard at work with a colleague, completing an inventory of the Institute laboratory, throwing out old and broken machines, repairing others, and preparing a budget to modernize the equipment to meet the standard she had set in her home. She was quite aware that her colleagues had put aside their enduring sense of the impropriety of appointing a woman for her to be there. People talked about Bassi a great deal in life as well as in death. Articles appeared in international journals reaching across Europe and all the way to North America, though not to California at this point in time. Her admirers were legion. There is no Bassi in London, Voltaire famously declared in 1744, and I would be much happier to be added to your Academy of Bologna than to that of the English, even though it has produced a Newton. Travelers described hearing her lectures and seeing her experiments. Among them was Benjamin Franklin's colleague, John Morgan, just after he finished his medical degree in Edinburgh, and shortly before he helped to found the American Philosophical Society and the Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. On his grand tour, James Boswell introduced himself by writing syncophonic fan mail in his stilted Latin, declaring that Bassi was known as far as the Hebrides. Bassi maintained an active correspondence with many leading scientists of her generation, and that correspondence is far more interesting, I should add, and I just want to give you a brief sense of this. Her correspondence allows us to see the things that that list of papers that no longer exist doesn't fully reveal. We see her as a scientist at work in the laboratory and on paper, discussing experiments, testing equipment, trading these things, and debating new ideas. She fully participated in a world in love with science, and was, needless to say, the subject of several biographies in her own lifetime. But fame is mercurial at best, and her celebrity receded not long after her death. Bassi gradually became a modest footnote to the history of women in science. Bologna named a street and a school after her, though few who pass by them know who she was. Her personal archive largely remained in Bologna, though, as I've said, the majority of her research papers disappeared, but we can reconstruct a lot from other things, which is what I've been doing. Her elaborate funerary monument, originally in Corpus Domini, also vanished and was reduced, which is what we see today if you go to Corpus Domini, to a faintly legible marble epitaph in the floor. At the 900th anniversary of the alleged founding of the University of Bologna, she was featured in a book on women and the university that I discovered in a bookstore on Via Zamboni in 1988. This is how I first learned about Laura Bassi, when I was a grad student doing research on an entirely different dissertation topic that had led me to Bologna that year. And so all this is to say that Laura Bassi has always been there for us to rediscover. Historical fame produces different kinds of commemoration, all of which reflect our desire to engage the past. As the recent array of popular engagements with Bassi might suggest, rediscoveries are increasingly taking novel forms. We have polar icebreakers. We even have cartoon art of the kind I've thrown up here. We have a wonderful children's book that was done in 2011 as part of the anniversary celebrations, and not just one, but two films, right? There is an earlier film of, Laura Bassi, Una vita straordinaria, that was done in 2011, and now this Rai documentary. But actually, I want to point out an example of a very early legacy that I think might be a fine ending point for my lecture today. And it is related to the family's physics cabinet. So after Bassi and her husband Veratti died, he dies in 1793, their surviving sons, by this point, the only daughter who survived infancy has died long ago because her daughter Caterina sadly dies at age 22 as she's about to become a nun in Corpus Domini, which is why Laura Bassi wanted to be buried there, right? To be next to her daughter in eternity. But their youngest son, Paolo, was the only one who had taken up a scientific career. So Paolo he and his brothers inherit it, but he's the only one using it. He then financially falls on very hard times. And by the early 19th century, by 1818, he has made an agreement to sell this catalog, this collection, which is the only reason we have a catalog, an inventory that's done when further sales occur after the original owner, right, who bought it from Veratti dies. And in this catalog, the inventory of the physics cabinet in 1820, we see the following: an English prism sent as a gift by Newton to Dottoressa Laura Bassi Veratti. This is such a fantastic example of commemoration, right, of the history we want to have and therefore we create, much like we invent these medieval precedents to make the reality of the 18th century woman professor, woman graduate possible. Newton, as some of you might recall, died in 1727. I think it's safe to say that Newton and Laura Bassi were not corresponding when she was 6 years old. So what really is this, right? This is some sort of misunderstanding of how English prisms end up in Bassi's cabinets. Of course, she had English prisms. She had English and Venetian prisms. These were the best forms of glass from which to make prisms, lenses, etc., for optical experiments, for achromatic telescopes, for all sorts of things. Now, I might have a longer story about how indirectly people misunderstand this, because in fact, one of her former students who was from Venice, or at least worked in Venice, gives her a set of English prisms that a philosopher of an earlier generation named Antonio Conti had, who indeed knew Isaac Newton directly from his long time in England. And so I suspect that there is some sort of mistelling of the story of Conti's prisms that then is conflated into the idea that Newton himself would have directly given an English prism to Laura Bassi. But we see how in the end, right, the legacy of Bassi is filled with myths and realities. We need to actually study and understand them both, but they don't all add up together, do they? And so needless to say, one of the things I must add is is the end of the Google Doodle biography, which led me to write this essay that I've just published, says that Bassi, at the end on this wonderful high note, that she continuously fought for gender equality in the 18th century. And as I was saying to some people before we started, not even Mary Wollstonecraft meets that criteria. This is the problem of trying to impose on the past things that we want to have in the present. Laura Bassi is far more interesting because that was actually impossible in her lifetime, to be continuously fighting for gender equality. So we need instead to look at what the possibilities were and see how she operated in them, including the, for us, curious fact that while women were inspired by Laura Bassi's story in the 18th century, which is a subject of an entirely different talk that I would be happy to give, she never herself had a female student, other than possibly her one daughter who survived infancy, Caterina. And there is a wonderful moment when Caterina is about 10 years old and a friend comes to town and he's talking about meeting with Laura Bassi, and he says, you know, she's pretty frustrated with her daughter because her daughter's not very studious. So my only image of Caterina, besides the fact that ultimately she either wanted to or was encouraged by her family to become a nun, we can never tell which, you know, without her surviving and telling us herself, was that she was not very studious, that she did not want to become the next Laura Bassi. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm really delighted to take questions and continue the conversation, but let me stop here and I will stop sharing my screen as well.
And thank you very much, Paula. And again, we are missing all the applauses, but I just only wish we could do that for this, what I think is an extraordinary lecture that you just gave us. So I have a few questions, but before I do that, I'd like to encourage other people who may not have discovered the Q&A button to add more questions to it. So I will just relay them. So you already addressed the first one. Did she inspire other women to follow in her footsteps? You said that she didn't have actually students that were women, but who were the women she actually inspired? I think you you mentioned Maria delle Donne, who was in a different field, but still quite close to her in terms of timeline. And also, as you said, her position was resurrected to welcome her. But what about the others?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. This is one of the reasons, you know, when I first worked on Laura Bassi, I mean, you can say she's like the alpha and omega of my research on women in science, because when I first saw her, I wrote a long article, you know, this is, you know, some years after my discovery of this book in 1988, you know, I write this long article, and it's obvious that she deserves a biography, but I'm finding all these other women. And so I thought, I'm not going to do that until I write about all the others. I don't want to treat her in isolation when there are so many more. So many years later, I actually have finished that process of studying all these others. I just was writing one on one of the women in Naples. So who does she inspire? She inspires, for example, she inspires a young woman from a small town in the Venetian Republic, the town of Rovigo, named Cristina Roccati. Cristina Roccati is the second woman to get a degree at the University of Bologna in 1751. And I think this is a good example of what I mean about not having female students, right? So Roccati, to my knowledge, is the first woman we can document who actually goes to university. She doesn't just show up like, you know, Athena out of the head of Zeus, having all the knowledge that she's done at home. No, she moves with her aunt to Bologna. Her aunt chaperones her while she goes to the university for 3 years, and then gets a degree also in philosophy with an emphasis on natural philosophy, i.e. physics, in 1751. And we know that Bassi and Roccati know each other. Laura Bassi accompanies Roccati through her degree ceremony, but she is not her maestra. She is not her professor. You know, we know she studies with other women. Roccati then goes back home and becomes professor of experimental physics at the local academy in Rovigo that still exists today, the Accademia dei Concordi. We have over 1,000 pages of manuscript physics lessons, but never once do these two women correspond after this moment in Bologna. But it is so clear there are one or two contemporaries in the Veneto who call Roccati un'altra Laura, right? Another Laura. Obviously, it's obvious, like she was meant to be a complete template, but it's like, it goes into the void. It's literally like the failed experiment. So in some ways, Bassi is an experiment that cannot be fully repeated. That is kind of an interesting takeaway, right? People are inspired, and there are these kind of false starts of various kinds. There, for instance, is a woman who is from, she's from Brescia, but lives in Salo because she married somebody from Salo. She's become locally famous as a poet, but she's clearly reading about Laura Bassi and some of these other women. And so, at age 39, she writes her last poem about never writing poetry again and becoming a scientist by studying mathematics because science is the important subject. She writes a short treatise that she gives as a debate, a discourse really, in the local academy, defending women's education and saying women need to do more useful things with their education than write poetry. Poetry is beautiful, I do it very well, but what about physics? What about mathematics? She never becomes a scientist. We have no evidence that this woman, Diamante Medaglia Faini, becomes a scientist, but we do have evidence that she studies mathematics. She finds the professor who will teach the woman to become the scientist. There are other examples, really briefly, Paolo, because it's an important thing, there are also the sort of rivals and contemporaries, right? Bassi is a contemporary of Émilie du Châtelet, the French translator of Newton, who becomes one of the other female members of the Bologna Academy of Sciences shortly before her death. And after she has published in French her own textbook, her Institut de Physique, that has been translated into Italian. And at that point, she's presented for membership. And I know that Laura Bassi is present at that meeting. But once again, do they have a long correspondence? Do they talk about their scientific work together? No. Fascinating, isn't it, right? Each one is sort of boxed like a bubble in each place, but they're very aware of each other. So yeah, what part of what I've been doing is looking at like, who are the women that can inspire the idea of Laura Bassi, both inspire her, but inspire the men who make her career, possible, who put her forward, who educate her. And then, yeah, once you have Laura Bassi, what does it inspire? So just again, to answer, rather at length now on this, by say circa 1750, the Bologna Academy has become an imagined community of women scientists because they have admitted in succession during the late 1740s and thereafter a handful of women very strategically from other cities, none of whom ever come to Bologna, with maybe one exception. They have Maria Gaetana Agnese is an honorary professor of mathematics on the books in Bologna for half a century, right, until her death in 1799, and never comes to Bologna. But she is a member of the Academy also, So I hope that helps everyone kind of get a sense of what I mean when I say the relations with other women are not what we're expecting, and we need to really understand that and understand why.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I would pick up, so this answers a few questions that people had, James, for example, on Émilie du Châtelet and her relationship with Laura Bassi. I will actually ask a different question, because of course, this is a physics department. We don't know very much about your work. How do you actually find all these things out? Where do you find these letters? And can you give us a clue of why her own writings were lost? Yeah,
no, I'm happy to. So what is great about Bassi is that she's there in multiple archives. So one is the archives of the university are a great place to see her relationship with the university. So when I talk about her writing letters for raises, yes, the archive of the University of Bologna is a place where requests for raises by professors go back centuries, and not all of them survive, many do, and you can go in. So I can pull out her folder where she is requesting raises and read those. I can also pull out the deliberations of the Bologna Senate, what's called, the part of the Senate that supervises the university and determines its budget, its staffing, etc. And I can look at where she fits in that, because that record is very complete. The archive of the Accademia dell'Istituto delle Scienze, the Bologna Academy of Sciences, is also a very rich and complete archive, very important archive for the history of science in this period, and not only because it's not just about Bologna, but all their foreign members and all the activities and things they're doing, they're reading, they're thinking about. Then the Bass Veratti archive, the family papers, we actually digitize this with the main repository of that is the Biblioteca Comunale dell'Archiginnasio, the communal library in Bologna. And so some years ago, shortly after the 2011 anniversary, my own university, the digital aspect of our library, worked with the Archigymnasio to digitize that. And I'm happy, maybe as a follow-up to the talk, I'll share that link. So anyone who wants to explore it can find, if you type in Bassi Veratti archive or Bassi Veratti Stanford, it'll come up right away. And so that's just a fraction, because then a lot of it is scattered everywhere. There are traces of Bassi, of course, in archives in the UK and in France and Germany, but most of it is various repositories. So partly what researchers like I do is that, we look at material that we find in a core set of depositories that are usually where the story happened. But then you look at this dispersed archive. So when I want to look at her correspondence, say with Volta writes her fan mail and introduces himself as a young electrical experimenter who wants her to know about his work at the recommendation of his colleague Spallanzani, right? Because they're both in Pavia. And so you can look at both sides, of that. So then I'm looking at the archive that's not in Bologna, but, wherever Volta's archive or Spallanzani, Voltaire's correspondence. Of course, Oxford is the center of the massive Voltaire project, actually, and the publication. So it's a great place to think about the relationship between Bassi, Voltaire, and Châtelet. Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm not sure if I answered the second half of your question about why they didn't survive. This is one of those tragedies. And, it's one that's almost precipitated from the moment of her death, because not long after she dies, a colleague writes Giuseppe Veratti and says, what about the rest of her papers? Are you going to publish? And he writes back a comment that's really interesting. He says, my wife was very cautious about publishing her research. I think, she was very cautious and careful about her reputation, and, publication invites commentary, criticism. So alas for us, she didn't rush into print, which is why it's so wonderfully ironic that there's now a Laura Bassi scholarship that was created a few years ago that is helping young researchers publish. I think that, I don't know if they understood this part of her story, that she didn't publish very much of what she did. But so what happens is all of these papers, all of the academicians, the Benedictines, were required to deposit the research papers they presented in the Institute archive. So that's great. So then they should have survived. I think we owe the absence of them to the Napoleonic era, where many archives in Italy are disrupted, right, are taken places and gone through, rifled through, and some stuff comes back and some stuff disappears, right? This is why there are certain archives in Paris, there's certain paintings in the Louvre that were once in Italy in different places. So yeah, the general consensus is that probably it's in that period of the early 19th century that this archive then goes, we don't know where, maybe somebody tucked it away and nobody ever found it again. So hope springs eternal in these moments that one day in some attic, somebody will discover the lost archive, because it can happen. But no one has so far. Believe me, we've all been looking. So if anyone does, could you let me know?
Right.
Yeah.
A couple of other questions. You've been very generous, Paula. One question is about the breadth of her work. Of course, Lazzaro Spallanzani is most famous for his research in physiology, I guess. So yeah. Did she also work outside what we consider traditional physics today?
Oh yeah, because again, we're not talking about modern disciplines and specialty. Let's keep in mind that the word scientist in English is not even invented till the 1830s, at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting. And people don't like that even then. So there's a kind of, you have to think of, and that's why I wanted to start with that comment that science is part of, a lot of science is part of philosophy, and so yes, people are not in very narrow specialized boxes. There's no clear credentialing or pathway to becoming a scientist generally, or even a particular kind of scientist. So people make connections across fields without thinking that they're crossing boundaries in this period. Nowadays we do it and we think we're crossing a boundary. They didn't think that way. And so, yeah, you have to keep in mind that she's married to a physician. So their collective knowledge of the sciences is enormously varied and comprehensive. And it's quite clear that she herself doesn't focus on, say, studying, the natural world, animals, plants, minerals. She's not unaware of issues there that might be interesting to somebody as an experimental physicist. So, I mean, there's this one moment that some of her younger disciples are busy doing all sorts of, bloody vivisections because they're fascinated with, Albrecht von Haller's theories of the irritability. This is the prelude to Galvani, who Galvani knows. Galvani is a younger colleague. He's not a direct student of Bassi, but he is a younger colleague who greatly admires her and definitely spent time in this laboratory. And, she shows up and they're in the midst of it and they're like, okay, could you hold the right ventricle, Laura? Well, we sort of then test this. Now hold the left ventricle and, tell us when it's pulsing, so yeah, so Spallanzani, when he does his work on regeneration, he sends his cousin Bassi boxes of salamanders and other little beings so that she can replicate his experience because he trusts her judgment, as did many people. Many people asked Laura Bassi to replicate their experiments in electricity, but also, yeah, as it turns out, animal regeneration with lizards and salamanders. So yeah, there's not a clear boundary, but overwhelmingly, I would say, this is why I emphasize that she is focusing on, Newtonian experimental sciences as her primary area. I think that's one of the reasons she gets fascinated at the end of her career in the 1770s with the problem of fixed air, is that she's reading Joseph Black. She's very well informed about English science, though I don't know how well or if she read English. Her French is very good, her Latin is excellent. So it's interesting about how she gets access to English knowledge. But of course, most of people in England are writing by, and it's getting translated into French. So there are a lot of ways, is the short answer.
Thank you, Paula. I will ask a final question in which I'll try to summarize some of the others. Looking from the perspective of 1750, obviously one might have thought it was really the beginning of something for women in science and academia, particularly because somebody like Bassi was not an aristocrat, was somebody from a ordinary background that was trying also to work to earn her living. And then something happened so that even today we are talking about shortage of women in STEM subjects. What actually happened? Do you have a clue or an idea why this initial burst of enthusiasm, perhaps in France and Italy and other places, did not take hold? What's your view?
Yeah, it's one of the essential questions for this material. And as you say, because Laura Bassi is not like so many of the others, Châtelet is an aristocrat, right? She can do whatever she wants. She has endless resources. Laura Bassi, no, this is somebody of modest means who has to earn a living. Her son ends up on public assistance when the entire economy tanks in the Napoleonic era. So yeah, why can't this produce, even the case of Maria dalle Donne is fascinating, right? That she is presented, she's born in the year that Laura Bassi dies. She is a peasant. She is, a young peasant girl who is discovered, I forget if it's by a relative or maybe a local priest, and they bring her into the city, they educate her, and so she gets this degree in medicine. She's made a member of the Bologna Academy. Then they revive the 25th position for the female Benedictine. But even with her, you can see the changing constraints, right? Changing times about finding the right role, because she ultimately does not teach men. She ultimately is reconfigured as a professor of obstetrics to teach midwives about the body in the early 19th century. So I think part of it, we want to think about is how the openness of this earlier period, there wasn't a specific outlet for what was the goal of women's education. And by the early 19th century, you begin to see people actually not only being more interested in educating young girls, but also with a very specific goal, right? The goal is to make, good wives and mothers, to have a female education, and that female education so well and fine that you might study botany because you might botanize with your, children. But what Jim Secret has called Newton in the nursery, which is a wonderful article about textbooks in English in the 18th century that kind of take Newton's physics and write it for children. And the Newton in the nursery idea doesn't really migrate into this new model of education for girls, right? There's a real sort of bifurcation. So in a way, institutionalizing everything, professionalizing everything, defining it, actually creates barriers that are more real in the 19th century than they are in the 18th century. So we have to go through this whole process. That's why when you look at the history of women getting university degrees, there is this incredible hiatus that is much of the 19th century, before, you know, these Italian universities that came so early to the idea of having a few women get degrees under very unique circumstances, then basically shut the whole project down in the early decades of the 19th century, and then come late relative to England or the US or France or Russia, you know, a number of places, to the idea of the modern opening up, not to a few, but to the many. You know, that it's not until, I think, the 1880s that a woman gets a degree in medicine. After Maria delle Donne at Bologna, it's not until like the early 20th century that a woman gets a law degree at Bologna, after this whole story of the medieval women lawyers. So yeah, I mean, it's that in a way we have to sort of say, on some level, we went through this period of defining, yes, there should be more education for women, but it should be this with this goal, it should be segregated. You know, and I say this as a graduate of a women's college that's founded in that period, right? That segregation in many ways did narrow things, as well as over time create possibilities within it, because many of the early women scientists of the modern era came out of these women's colleges within, say, Oxford or the US, places like Vassar, famous for its observatory, you know, et cetera. There's much more to say about it, I'm sure, but I hope that at least gives the audience a general idea of how I like to think about these issues. So it's not a story of even progress, right? What kind of precedent is this, and for whom? That's why our rediscovery of these things is important, because we are reinventing the wheel when we have these discussions.
Fascinating. We could talk for a long time about this and related matters, but for tonight, I think we'll have to thank you, and thank you everyone for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for coming. I really appreciate it.